Hey, everybody, welcome back to the History of Automation podcast. I am joined again by two legends of automation here, Gary Wilkinson and Jeremy Pollard. And we have a special topic we're going to cover today. We're going to be talking about the very beginning of the founding of Wonderware, a legend in the industry, In Touch and that product line we heard so much about in the 90s. They were just like the number one market share in HMI SCADA PC based. And so, but before we get into that, and Gary's going to do this, I will throw up in post production a copy of his book so you can see his book. It's very affordable on all major platforms. But before we jump into what Gary wanted to talk about, I know Jeremy had a couple of minutes of things he wanted to talk. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jeremy, and then we'll go to Gary to talk about the Wonderware.
Okay, thank you so much, Shawn. It's appreciated. Good afternoon, Gary. How are you?
Good afternoon. Hello.
We left off with the Allen Bradley Rockwell history somewhere in the mid-90s, and Windows 95 started to take off. The PLC 5 and networking was there. Increased memory size. The availability of data was there through networking. IC 61131 was starting to come on board. And in the mid to late 90s, there was an explosion of data. And with PLC 5s and the compact and control logics platforms that came out with regards to Rockwell, the PLC 2s didn't have as much of the data as a PLC 5 or a PLC 3 would have. And of course, with compact logics and pyramid integrators that are out there, there was a huge need for data analysis, data gathering, and of course, data presentation. And I remember sitting in on a call with Jerry Brooks and Gary Wilson from Wonderware in 1991. And the product had just sort of come out because Windows 3.0, 3.1 came out. And they were showing me how this product made quick work out of stupid things like aligning to the left, automatic spacing horizontally and vertically, and the stuff that DOS stuff just didn't have. And it was amazing to see how far that they had come so quickly. So that when the early to mid 90s came about and Windows 95 came about, everything started to take off in Windows-based SCADA and HMI became believable, if you will, because of, the first few years, Windows wasn't what you would call all that stable. So, leading into the history of Wonderware, 95 to 96 to 97, there was a need for access to data, and there was a need for access of displaying data to operators through HMI and SCADA. And Wonderware at the time was eating everybody's lunch. Involution got caught behind the 8-ball. Rockwell didn't have a contender, shall we say, at the time. And of course, now everything's changed. But Wonderware set the tone for the leader of the pack. And they were the leader of the pack for a long, long time. But realizing that historically, it's the PLCs that had the data that Wonderware needed to eat for lunch and display on a plate for all that was watching. So I just wanted to sort of set the table for the whole idea of how Wonderware became the juggernaut that it actually did.
And
so
thank
I
you for
turn it
that,
over to
Jeremy.
Gary.
Really appreciate that. And that's a great way to cap off our last episode. And I just want to thank Gary again. We had some technical difficulties. I really want to thank him again for coming on. I want to encourage everybody to go out there and grab his book, because a lot of what he's sharing with us, you'll find even more details in the book. But with that, Gary, are we ready to go ahead and bring up your presentation right now?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. And I will turn the floor over to you, sir.
So are you looking at what I'm looking at? The start of Wonderware?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So I'll control it then. To set the table, I just like to go back to the time and the place. And the time and the place was the late 80s. Incredible things happened, like the fall of the Berlin Wall and you go ahead about 5 years, and Netscape goes public. So that's kind of the time period that all this happened. So much happening in our industry and so much happening in the world. And the space between Hollywood and Disneyland, which literally it was, Wonderware was founded. And it was founded on April Fool's Day, 1987. That's no typo, and that's certainly on purpose because Apple Computer was famously founded on April Fool's Day as well, 1976. Chose that day specifically. Love that stuff. And the co-founders were Dennis Morin and Phil Huber. Talk a little bit about that here shortly. But the other thing I want to say is, where was it founded? It was a sister company is probably not the right word, but the 5 founders of Wonderware, the original 5, all worked at Triconics in Irvine, California, and literally kind of went across the street and founded a company that became incredibly successful as well. Both companies, Triconics and Wonderware, were at the right place at the right time. And Southern California kind of played a big part of that because customers loved, and you could even talk to families that are visiting Southern California. And I think that was a part of it as well. So I just put up these 2 slides to kind of emphasize the sunny Southern California. By the way, we're both headquarters. They're both owned by Schneider Electric right now, but they're both still there in Irvine, California. How about that? Despite so not Southern California, but Southern California, but not Silicon Valley. Which was a change. Their inspiration came from Silicon Valley. So now, before I go to the questions, and I'll just make that maybe that you guys, we could discuss each question.
Can I interrupt just for a second?
Please, anytime.
Why did they leave Triconics?
Well, very good question. It depends who you ask, but if you ask the historian, and it was February of 1986, Triconics didn't have a lot of money. So the founder of Triconics, his name was John Weimer, was invited to leave the board at that time. And the board, actually the venture capitalists, owned Triconics. They were losing money. They lost money. They were founded in 1984. And a new CEO was installed who had been the vice president of sales named Bill Barkowitz. And Bill Barkowitz of Triconics was the executive visionary whose job was to grow Triconics and sell the company, because that's what venture capitalists do. That's what startups do. And he had a patron named Chuck Cole, who was the prime investor in Triconics. But it was that February of 1986 where Dennis Morin got laid off from Triconics. Ironically, his future co-founders, Phil Huber, Cole Chevalier, stayed. So they're all Triconics employees, but that was the, did that answer your question? So February of 86.
Yeah, the beginning of it. Was there a product that Triconics was trying to?
Yeah, it was called
historical.
Absolutely.
Discussions.
So Triconics decided they were a hardware company, and there was a matter of something called TriView.
Mm-hmm.
And TriView was kind of what Dennis Morin worked on. Well, Triconics didn't have the money for TriView. Dennis Morin was a coder, as among other things, but they weren't going to fund that project, which was really his vision. Mm-hmm. So Triconics had to put their money in getting a PLC out there, a safety PLC, and it just wasn't the money, and that was just a fact. And that's directly from Bill Barkowitz, who made the decision, and Dennis Morin. It was just the timing and Triconics.
So if you're not going to build it, I'm going to go and build it.
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah.
Okay.
There were some details in there, but that was a great question, and absolutely we can trace it back to that.
Thank you, Gary.
Please. So I'll start on, but again, keep this free flow. I wanted to jump to the mercurial founder, the legendary co-founder, actually, Dennis Morin, and he was a co-founder with a brilliant gentleman who's probably a bit younger, and well, it's definitely a bit younger than Dennis, but his name was Phil Huber. He's still active today in the entrepreneurial. So Dennis gives his co-founding credit to Phil, who was kind of the technical guy, and he was the guy who went up to Microsoft several times and spoke with the Microsoft visionaries. And before Windows 3.0 came out, there was something called a technology called NetDDE, which Phil Huber could claim built that.
Mm-hmm.
But he licensed it, of course, to Wonderware. Licensed it, of course, to Microsoft. Microsoft is not famous for giving a lot of companies credit as their background, but they certainly are successful. So this visionary, you can see just the charisma of this gentleman. And I wanted to show a slide. Dennis was a very, very proud man, and his pride was matched probably only by his being stubborn. And he believed in something. So at 40 years old, he was very proud to say he had been fired from every job he had. And so he just went and started his own company. He didn't go to college. He actually studied to be a chef. He loved cooking. He has an incredible background of a person, but here he is, 40 years old. And I asked him what his management style was. And I asked him what his management style was around the year 2010, after he had already created this incredible company.
Mm-hmm.
And he loved to say this: my management style is seduction. I seduce my employees into falling in love with their jobs. So you can kind of read that a couple different ways, because Dennis Moore himself personally has quite a reputation in the social atmosphere. But this was used, it may have been the time, but employees at 4:00, that parking lot tended to be busy at 6. It tended to be busy about 8 p.m., 10 p.m. I know those employees, and they did fall in love with their jobs. They were building something that was exciting. It was the late 80s and especially the early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, it was exciting. And Dennis Moore was the leader. And just to show kind of one more picture, a little bit mature, Dennis Moore founded his company April 1st, 1987, left his company unceremoniously December 1995 in one of those real Silicon Valley lore board coups, you could say. Dennis, you're fired, and here's the new CEO. Of course, once again, the venture capitalists made so that was a big day. Dennis was not happy, but on the other hand, he was probably ready. Would you donate your life to that? But it was quite a dramatic entry and exit of Mr. Dennis Moore, who left with a lot of money, especially back in the days. And if you ever want to Google something called the Rock House in Laguna Beach, where he bored his house, a magnificent house, into the rock in Laguna Beach, and it was incredible. I've been there, and so going back to, here's parties. We'll talk about the parties, and here were some of the guests at his parties. Unbelievable parties. But let's go back to the questions, and I'll let you guys take over, or we'll do a little bit free flow if there's particular questions. And anyone's welcome to ask and answer. In fact, Jeremy, I think you answered the last one, which was another key. Dennis just had knew this is the type he's going to do. It was unlike Triconics, which had to go, and most companies had to go find the customers. This sales distribution network, probably the brainchild of Jerry Brooks and Gary Wilson, was really key. Now, Triconics could only sell their products to who? Refineries that really needed a high-end safety system. Wonderware could sell their products to supermarkets, to actually prisons. I mean, there was just no end who Wonderware could sell those 2 floppy disks to. Obviously, the main thing we're interested in is automation. And of course, everybody loved it in the operating room, because finally you had this graphical interface, and it was fun, it was easy to use, and you could adapt it to the operation. So
yeah, a lot for out there too.
Free.
Just for the audience, I mean, there was no JavaScript. There was, in the late 80s, there was no HTML, JavaScript. I think the first web browser came out in 1990. So if you're thinking, well, wouldn't you have just created like a web page and like why would you have to have a software application that came on disks? There was no, internet as we know it today. There was no web browsers did not exist. And so the way we did things in the 80s and in the 90s, early 90s, was with software you would buy. And the thing you needed was from the software is you needed it to be user friendly. So there was a lot of things you could do if you just wanted to get a copy of C++ and write it yourself. But in the early 90s, even before Visual Basic was big, you wanted to buy an application. And I think, and Gary, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying is because this was a human machine or graphical design interface that could talk to anything and do anything, that it could be used outside of industrial automation.
Yes, absolutely. And that meant their customer base was just pretty much anyone who could afford those two floppy disks. And the user liked it. That was the key. The user, you put it in your hand, let's say it's an iPhone. All of a sudden, it wasn't the first. Well, in this case, Wonderware was not the first. Intellution was the first, but they caught the windows. They were at the right place, the right time, and had the right vision. And it was amazing. And it still is amazing.
The big Intellution had a market under DOS, and it was a software only solution. And not a lot of people knew DOS well to begin with. And it wasn't necessarily the friendliest because of all the command line stuff. When Windows hit and InTouch hit at the same time as Windows, because they were being developed sort of in tandem. Mm-hmm. And they were getting from my understanding, getting a lot of insight from Microsoft to the ins and outs of the operating system, so that when Windows 3.0 came out, bang, Wonderware and InTouch came out. But it was one of the first pieces of software under Windows that had access through all the drivers in a protected memory system. And Shawn, correct me if I'm wrong here. Windows 3.0 had that protected memory system, didn't have the overlay drivers that DOS had to have. And I don't think OPC was around at that point. No. But you had to develop communication drivers for the PLCs and devices you were talking to. And they did a lot of that through DLLs. And they were able to speak with, like the top 10 PLCs, if you will, sort of out of the box. But it was a pure software solution, which Alan Bradley was still using Advisor PC, I think, back in the late 80s. And the thank you, just memory. One of the companies that I met in the early 90s when I moved back to Canada from Houston was Westhead Associates, and they were the distributor for Wonderware.
Okay.
In Canada. But Westhead had a Unix box that they were using for HMI and SCADA. So they were totally tied to hardware that was not PC based. And that's why they jumped on board of the Wonderware train, if you will. But it began to point towards the fact that you could buy 2 disks, install it on basically on an IBM PC, running Windows 3.0, and bang, you're up and running. And you're talking with your PLC. Unheard of.
Yeah, and we should say that Windows wouldn't be possible without that IBM PC standard, right?
True enough.
So we had that IP. That's one of the inflection points we talked about in the previous episode. Windows 3.0 was really the Windows edition that started gaining steam. We know it skyrocketed through the roof with 95, mainstream. But Windows 3.0, you'll be hard pressed to find people who used. You'll find a lot more people who have used Windows 3.0, Windows 3.1, Windows 3.11, Windows for Workgroups than you will anybody who used Windows 1 and 2. They were just such early versions. But based on that IBM PC, which you could get from multiple vendors, and now you had a PC that had Windows on it. And yes, great. Windows 3.1 ran on top of DOS. Absolutely. But unlike DOS, where if I wanted to go to my word processor, I'd have to exit my PLC programming software. With Windows, I could have both my PLC programming software up, maybe my WinLogix 5, and I could have my email up if you're lucky to have email back then. Most people didn't. And I could have InTouch up, right? So you could have multiple applications running, and you only needed HP or whoever to give you one driver for your printer, and then all your applications could use it. Whereas in DOS, every application had to have its own printer driver.
Right.
So just such a great time to hit the market for InTouch. And Gary, I'm assuming their first product was InTouch. Is that correct?
Yes, the companion, which escapes, the one was for the graphical to build it, and the other was imported. So, there was two parts to it,
Okay.
and that's once the operator or anybody, actually, even me, that was the simplest of use. Kind of build your graphics, and then you import it, and that's what actually ran. So there were two parts. What I would ask both of you is that during that time period, there was famously Windows 95. So a company like Triconics is not going to use the Windows 95. They just were not confident in the security and the basic parameters of it. But Windows NT was a technological leap, and that's where Triconics went based on the market. Wonderware may not have had that restriction, even though they were every place Triconics was, Wonderware was sure to follow. And I was wondering if you had an opinion about did companies wait on Windows 95 to go to NT, or
from my perspective, we got certified on. All my colleagues had to get certified on Windows NT. So if we think about Windows NT 3.5, think about Windows 3.11, okay? And if you think about Windows NT 4.0, think about Windows 95. So the look, right? And so then after 4.0, we have Windows 2000 and then Windows XP, which of course the 98 and then XP, right? So we have that joining at XP, but the Windows NT, well, they spent a lot of time when we went to Microsoft certification on Windows NT, drilling into us. What Jeremy alluded to earlier is that protective memory space. One of the issues with Windows 3.1 and Windows 3.1 running on top of DOS is different applications could try to use the same memory and then blah, right? You get, if you're writing over each other's memory, right? Just think if you had two programs in your PLC trying to write to the same I/O. Disaster. Well, that's the same thing that would happen when you didn't have protected memory. And Windows NT had that protected memory, and it was much more reliable, much less likely to blue screen. It was a little bit more expensive, and it wasn't as user-friendly. It didn't have all the multimedia that Windows 90 had. I mean, Windows 95, came on CD. It had videos on it, it had games on it. I mean, it was just a multimedia, fabulous product. But, it wasn't designed to run 24/7, 365 without blue screening, right? And so that's what the Windows NT did. And a lot of what we were hearing from Rockwell and ICOM, at least from my background, I'll turn it over to you, Jeremy, in a minute, was that in industrial plants, you want to use NT. Do not use Windows 95, 98. That is for your home. And Microsoft even said this. They had I used to have this hung up on my cubicle, is Microsoft, right from Microsoft. Home is for home use, not for business use. Do not use home for business use, right? And so, people would buy laptops that have Home Edition on them and then be like, hey, how come it's not supported? Well, it's not for business. But long story short, that we don't even think about that because that convergence at Windows XP, that left all that behind. There was no more NT versus commercial, no NT versus 90X. So let me pitch it over to you, Jeremy, to give your answer.
Well, the NT stuff was really interesting because of the RTOSs that came out, the real-time operating systems through the kernel.
Yeah.
And VentureCom, I think, was one of them, VRTX, because Windows is not real-time. And people wanted real-time information. And Dick Morley always said to me, what's real-time? It's as fast as you need it. So a second could be real-time.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with temperature, and 100 milliseconds could be real time if you're dealing with flow. But when you're dealing with development of graphics, etc., what's real time? So it's real time enough is what he always said. And with NT, you got a lot of companies that went to the point of guaranteeing 10 millisecond response times of different applications and stuff. But when Windows 95 came out, people began to become more comfortable with it. NT was more for the guru type guys or the IT guys setting and I mean, I don't know if you guys remember OS2 or not, but
Oh yes,
yeah, we did a little bit of work with when I was down in Houston. They wanted to port the programming software to OS2 and did it. Then of course it died on the vine because OS2 did. But OS2 wasn't a bad platform to build on, but it just never gained the traction. And that was like 88 and 90. But Windows 95 gave everybody permission, in my opinion. Technically, it may not have been as solid as NT, but for SCADA and HMI, does it have to be that solid?
Well, and if you're In Touch or if you're Wonderware and you want to get the biggest audience, you need to support it. You need to support
Absolutely
the consumer operating system. For anybody who wants to go back, and it's a pretty interesting story about OS2 and Microsoft and Windows and how they're working together and then they stop working together. It's very similar to what Apple and Microsoft did with licensing a version of their operating system. And of course, it all goes back to the godfather who created the operating system and with the mouse. I think it was the old Xerox guys with their
oh, absolutely, the Xerox, all that stuff came to Xerox.
Yep. They really were the ones who created it, and everybody else is saying, "No, it's ours. No, it's ours." But in any case, let me hit it back to you, Gary.
Yeah, I don't think those executives who at Xerox are kept their jobs that much longer after they let Bill Gates and Steve Jobs tour their free stuff. I mean, it's very easy to find YouTube videos on there that are you sure you want to let these guys see all our stuff? And yeah, it's just a toy. Well, and another thing that strikes me is, let's say maybe not quite 40, but certainly 35 years later, I bet Windows market share of these, frankly, the critical plants in the world are still using Windows. The critical industry, and critical I mean by the safety industry, the refineries, plants like that, they're not really open to hey, they've got a new version of this software. They're not really famous for changing. They like something. Nuclear industry, which I have a lot of experience with, is probably that way more than anybody. We got something works. Okay, 40 years later, it's still working. Fine with us. It's amazing that Windows they weren't built for this market. They love the home market, but they pretty much own the industrial market as well. And I don't see anybody putting Linux in or which is fantastic for Windows, right?
PC-based control was also a going concern in the 80s and early 90s. And NT played a big part in that. PC-based controls are still being used now, like with Beckhoff, et cetera. But I mean, they're all turning to Linux because of the stability.
Well,
but I'm not sure that you would want to run an HMI out on the plant floor under Linux.
Well, people do, and
they do.
They have to abstract the operating system.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost, if we go back to some of the closed systems that, well, even if you think about a panel view, right? Whatever generation we talk about, I mean, you much don't know what OS it's running. Is it running Windows CE? Is it running Windows 10 IoT? Mm-hmm. Is it, is it running some custom kernel? It's you don't interface it with it on the operating system level. Typically, you interface on it, download your project and run it, right? And so you go into configuration. And so I think a lot of companies have been very successful in basing their software or their runtime engine on Linux, right? Versus designing their own, which I think is what the big guys have done. They have their own OSs that they've had for decades, and they just make it better and better. But Windows, the nice thing about Windows is it has market share in every industry. In virtually every industry, it has such great market share that you can buy an app and you can buy an app and be sure it's going to run on it, right? And so it's that platform that makes, it's kind of like the IBM PC. It's that platform that makes everything work together, like the PCI bus or your graphics card. Just having that commonality. You remember the story of the foundation of ISA, right?
Mhm.
And how they got started and how standards actually get started because of some disastrous events where fire companies couldn't hook up to each other's trucks or each other's pipes, and
Mhm.
and so standards can be very good. But let me turn it back to you, Gary.
Mhm.
Yeah, just amazing. And one of the questions I don't have on here is who were their competitors? And we talked last week about who was Triconic's competitors because, well, there was actually two. They were the third one. There was August Systems first and ICS Triplex, and Triconics was the smallest and least funded of the three. And a couple years later, there was only one. Well, actually, the other two got sold off, but the Triconics pretty much grabbed about a 60-70% market share in a market they themselves created. And a little bit of insight on board meetings.
Mhm.
There was Bill Barkowitz, the CEO of Triconics. Well, Bill, do you want to buy your competitors? Bill said, no. I think I'd like them to keep operating because they can keep spending marketing dollars. They can keep developing, and that's less we have to spend. So that's just a little insight that I was able to get from actually both boardrooms. Amazing. Wonderware did not have a competitor.
No.
that is really good because Jeremy, as you said, the big guys were just didn't see a need for that product, and Intolution, which was the leader, didn't have Windows. Okay, so I wanted to actually go ahead a little bit, and then I'll come back to these questions because
Please.
it just really just to talk about the amazingness that Wonderware still is. And so we showed the co-founder. We talked a little bit about his management style, and the employees would agree. But it probably would not be politically correct nowadays, right? However, back then, if you knew Dennis Morin, it was spot on. He was always active after this, but once he left Wonderware, he actually went to chef school in Paris.
Oh.
And he just had so many interests. So he was not yet 50. He had a lot of money, and he lived quite an adventurous life, shall we say. And not a happy camper with the Wonderware stock, which actually did tank a little bit after he left, but it sure came up, and it came up high enough where in 1998 Wonderware was purchased by the same company that purchased Triconics, which at the time was CB. So, but Dennis had already made his money, and that's typical of big companies. But he was really great at lecturing and inspiring. So I want to go over some of the parties because, what's that have to do with these? Well, had a lot to do with it because Dennis used these. He just spent all the money. He rented the Superdome. I think at one time, the biggest, most ostentatious parties, cruises, because that was part of the brand. And anybody who ever attended a Wonderware party will not forget it. This is just some of the last one was actually the Pointer Sisters where Dennis was in charge.
I was there.
And,
Really?
that's fantastic. That was in Santa Monica, California, at the kind of the airport hangar.
Mhm.
And there was an astronaut came in. Do you remember who that astronaut?
I don't. I was probably at the bar getting a beer.
Well, Jeremy, I prepped you for this answer. I gave you the answer that you're supposed to come up right on with. I didn't remember, but I only remember it now when I said, "Well, Gary, you don't remember it either." But his name was Alan Shepard.
Yes.
Oh.
And also made a dramatic entrance. And Alan was actually selling a book at the time, so he was really available.
Mhm.
And I believe he was officially the first man, was the first American in space. The first man in space was a Russian, but the first American. So he still had, back in the day, this was actually 95, an incredible presence. So the Pointer Sisters opened up. And if you were at that party, the main thing is you don't remember it. That was, I was at the bar is the best way to describe that party.
Oh, great. And you know what? After I did some consulting for Wonderware in the early 90s with meeting Jerry Brooks and Gary Wilson and being involved with Westhead to some degree. And I used to go to the ISA shows and the IPC shows and the the shows in Chicago, and Wonderware would always throw the party, and I would always somehow gather an invitation. I probably went to about 5 of them, but every freaking one of them was like 4,000 people, Dr. Hook, Pointer Sisters, the Neville brothers, and the food and it was just amazing. And it was the talk of the town. Every show, it was always the talk of the town.
That was Dennis Moore, and Dennis was not above poaching competitors, poaching employees from competitors. By the way, hey, we've got a party for you. So it's an amazing man, and Dennis, of course, we had some help, but this was his vision. So this is an important part of their culture is these parties. You don't think of Microsoft or the companies we process control, but this is part of the culture and how they.
The word that you just used, I think, defines a lot of what happened in the 90s, and that's culture. And when I was at Wonderware headquarters a couple of times, and the culture that was fostered, one of you've got work to do, but if you want to go to the gym, you go to the gym. I remember Dave Smith would always go, like it didn't matter what was going on. It's kind of like, oh, I just need to go to the gym. And away he went. But the culture of companies back in the 90s is so different than what it is today. And I heard from somebody that was connected, if you will, that these parties were running $1 million. And
no doubt.
For them to have that kind of after-tax money to put into a party for their customers and for their employees and their competitors, it was fascinating to me. But again, I think that was just part of the culture. I think that's an important part of who Wonderware was.
So let me this slide is actually the 5 original members of Wonderware. So let's go back to, of course, Dennis Moore was the co-founder, but he was not the CEO, because there's always these people. Who do they call them? We call them venture capitalists. Mm-hmm. Same with Triconics. They had the money. So everything Dennis did, by the way, I need $1 million for the party. Well, you've got to be a heck of a salesman to get $1 million for a party when we're not moving that much product. So you can, it's a tribute to Dennis's vision, but he was not the CEO. He was the co-founder, because the board insisted, I think I'm on the next page, that Peter Pitzker, who was also a co-author of the Triconics business plan. He's a veteran, seasoned venture capitalist. He's a Stanford graduate. The board said, Dennis, you're great, but you're not quite ready for the CEO, so we're going to put Peter Pitzker. And he indeed was the CEO until they felt Dennis was ready, which was not really until 3 or 4 years later, 1990, 1991, where Dennis got the official title of CEO and Peter could take some money and take a break. So those venture capitalists did want, somebody there in the executive room, and that was Peter Pitzker. So that's an irony. So everybody knew Dennis was the heir in waiting, and he ran the company, but there's still a board here, and you can imagine Dennis's influence and personality in getting those parties. So these were the 5 regional engineers that literally were working for Triconics, and they laid off Dennis. The 4 actually stayed there. And this is a story that doesn't please everyone who was there at the time. Bill Uroni, Cole Chevalier, Jerry Kuckler, Phil Huber were still doing key jobs. And in the book, I said they were doing some moonlighting. They went over to Dennis' house a few days a week and before. So they literally worked at Triconics, at least a year, maybe a little bit more before at Triconics. And they were, as I said, doing a little moonlighting. So I don't want to cast any aspersions, because I'm sure that goes on. Who would not take a phone call from somebody and say, well, okay, I'll come to dinner, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a period. So 4 out of these 5, only Dennis was actually not a Triconics employee at the time. These were key people. And the bottom one, Ray Norder and JQ, they were from Utah, but they were big money people. But the first big money was actually from Orange County, a guy named Jerry Spellman, who was a World War II vet, and he was just impressed with Dennis. So he said, okay, here's 100,000. Yeah, because you cooked a good dinner. And that was Dennis. That was Dennis. And Jerry Spellman daughter is probably still working for Wonderware. They just
really
amazing. Yeah. And she's a fantastic person. But that was the money. And Jerry was very, very low key, did not want to be on the board, but he was impressed by Dennis's passion and vision and business plan. Mm-hmm. So, and then the big money came in, the big money, and they needed the big money.
Who else did Ray Nordis? The name
it was one
rings a bell. So there's somebody else that he was involved with that's big.
Ray Nordis is a big name. So Shawn, we assigned you to Google that because he was a big one. Funding one of the, I think it was a large company out of probably where. The later Google CEO, Eric Schmidt, involved in that. So Ray Nordis was a big name, and he was on the board. Even to mention that, we all know that. And when that kind of money came in, that was serious stuff. And obviously vendors gave him breaks, and people said, okay, this is a place to work. So good question. Don't have the answer off the top of my head. The technology. And you guys have already said it, and with both of your experience, Shawn and Jeremy, you see from a different perspective, wow, it's easy to use, in touch, the graphical interface. And for me, the last bolt is the one I probably physically worked with as an engineer, because I could take my tag name database that came from an Excel spreadsheet, but as long as it was on Excel, everybody could read it. And that was the gift and the avenue that Wonderware had. The Excel spreadsheet, the development of that, those Microsoft applications, they just were installed with Windows. Brilliant technical decision. A couple more just to show you. Let's go back to the culture, okay? And Jeremy, you remember this? And when this came out,
one of many.
Yeah, one of many. Of course, the police, or let's say the social police at the time. No, you cannot do this. Well, guess what? This was an ad, and if you're at the time, if you're looking in a very conservative industry, you're looking at, let's say, Control magazine, or all those magazines. I looked at those magazines, and I see pictures of instrumentation that looks pretty good. There's nice tools. I need that. Here's everyone's bra. What was that again? What was that?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly what Dennis wanted. And I, as a researcher, I actually, had to see some of the stills from this photo shoot. I know Dennis was there and Phil Huber was there. So what I wouldn't do as an artist myself, as a writer, my research here, but this just grabbed attention. It probably would not work today, but it sure got attention, right?
I bet you it still would, Gary, because when you see that, well, what's Wonderware? Because everybody wants to know.
Well, that was the plan words, Jeremy. You said
absolutely
it spot on. It was
the one I remember the most was the clothesline with all kinds of lingerie hanging on it, and this is not Wonderware.
Yeah, I just took a snippet of those ads, but of course, what did those ads do? They caught attention, a lot of attention. You might have just said, "Hey, there's a page in this magazine." So outrageous, right? Outrageous marketing. I teach business at the university today. I don't think I'm going to show this slide to my students today. I'll let them. But they're all going to be, they're going to be marketers. They're future business leaders tomorrow. I actually truly believe that. So maybe someday, obviously my book is public and this is pictures in the book, but very, very interesting. It just depends. As Jeremy said, it's so not Wonder. It's not underwear. It's Wonderware.
Yeah.
And the brilliant name. They just was a placeholder, and they just say, let's go with that.
Gary Wilson said something to me when I was with him and Jerry. About the line of advertising, because when they went to sort of the PR firm, if you will, that they were dealing with, and whether it was a PR firm or not, I don't know. It's all about memory. But they did say something about the PR firm said something about, so what is this about your underwear? And somebody actually said that, and they said, no, it's not underwear, it's Wonderware. That spawned
Aha.
the advertising sort of glitch, if you will, or the stick for throughout their history, if you will.
Now,
Okay, so
Jeremy, being
my
associated with
bartender just showed up.
Jeremy, with your background in publications, I mean, if they brought this to you, do you mind if we, put this back in as one of the ads? I mean, what would your reaction be?
Oh, I got to tell you, when I first saw the clothesline one, I was laughing, like laughing out loud, because the industry back in the late '80s, and I'm trying to remember, ICOM, the all of the shows like National Manufacturing Week, IPC, ISA, all of us that, because I was working with Teledenkin at the time, and we would be in the booth. We would have shirt, ties, jackets. And for Steve Burt from ICOM and Eric Noreen made some level of decision somewhere that this is just too stuffy, right? So they went to t-shirts or like golf shirts.
Mhm.
And everybody, oh, we can do that. So everybody started to loosen up. So before it was always about selling on technical prowess, how much we don't use this much memory. There's all kinds of technical things that people were trying to market and sell stuff on. And Wonderware comes up, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with the technicals, nothing to do with the OS, nothing to do with the platform, nothing to do with the ease of use. Grabs your attention. And honestly, the first time I saw the clothesline one, I just absolutely railed on it. It was so funny because it wanted you to find out what the heck Wonderware was. And at the end of the day, the problem with it all, because in the magazines back then, you had those bingo cards, right? You had to circle a number and then mail it into the magazine publisher to get information as to what the heck is this, and it's prevalent today. If you watch CNN, you will get a pharmaceutical advertisement every 5 minutes. Ask your doctor if it's right for you. Well, what is it? Nobody knows what it is. And it's that kind of intrigue.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like, no, I can't say that. I can't say that online. I'm sorry. I'll have to say something else. But at the end of the day, the intrigue is so strong. And it was back at a time where innovation was huge and it was happening all the time that people signed up for it. What is Wonderware?
I think if you didn't live through the 80s and 90s, there was the end of the Cold War. There was an excitement. There was the birth of the internet, the birth of
Mhm.
online access, AOL, CompuServe, then the web. There was
Mm-hmm.
an excitement building up into the .com boom, and then we know 2001 and everything that happened then. But
Mm-hmm.
that late 80s, early 90s, it seemed to be a ramp of excitement, and people
Yeah.
were, we got new computers, we got new operating systems, we got CD-ROMs, we got, it was just every year there was
Mhm.
something new, and that you were stepping up the ladder. Things were exciting. We got full
Mhm.
motion video on our computers now, and every it was just not in computing and just not industrial automation. It was in all technologies, all industries, right?
Mhm.
Compact discs and
Mhm.
MP3 players. So it was an exciting time, and it was a time of a lot of innovation. And even ICOM is a smaller player. They did a lot of innovative things. They were doing. They were. I still remember some of the weekends we used to do with ICOM, and they would invite all the wives to come too, and they
Mhm.
would do things with the wives while the guys learned about the software. So it was just a very special time,
It was.
and hopefully we'll have another run like that sometime in the future, because that excitement about new technologies and everything that wasn't proprietary, it was open systems, and it was just a very exciting time. Gary, I think it might be one way to close out here might be to ask you just there's a couple of things on here that you didn't cover that I was hoping you might be able to cover
Would you like to
before.
go back to the questions, or I can answer question number 3. I can answer question number 4 as well, which is kind of like with those moonlighting employees, frankly, and Dennis Morin's vision. And so, where did they begin? In Dennis Morin's cramped apartment, where he hosted his 4 friends from Triconics. Officially, they began in Irvine, California. That's say across the street from Triconics. So yeah, and they're still there. Key employees, boy, there was so many. And I'll just say, how did they attract those employees? Dennis Morin would just poach them. He just was a people person. Very Steve Jobs like, come work with me and change the world. He was that guy.
And can I add a word into all of this, Gary?
Please.
Because I believe, as to Shawn's thought process of innovation in the late 80s and the 90s, what was happening back then was passion. And passion drove people to do things that they may not have or would have done, like leave a company to go to a startup. And they attracted so much great talent, certainly because of Dennis's passion for, and of course the culture. But man, oh man, they had some really good people. Really,
I agree. I was not one of them, but I just have my own story of 10 years later, and I had just spent 20 years in the military industrial complex, and I was ready for a change. And I remember literally being in the parking lot and walking up to this company called Triconics, and the economy was good back then. It was early mid 90s, and I just said to myself, whatever these people are doing, I don't care if they're making donuts, I'm in. There was just electricity coming out of that building, literally. And it was also the area, Irvine, there was a lot of startups, but they got me that way. I said, whatever it is. And it was just, you walked in that building and there was just electricity, there was energy, there was mission, there was a passion. And Wonderware was probably Triconics times 4. But, they didn't have to have a factory, which was also an amazing thing. But, the electricity, people just saw it. And that's how they attracted the key people, the key programmers, and of course, the executives and the money. And, Dennis Morin gets the lion's share of credit for that.
No, absolutely.
Well, if there's anybody watching who wants to come on the show and meet with us and talk about your own Wonderware kind of, early days, whether you worked there or whether you were an early user of the product, we, the 3 of us, would love to have you on. We have lots of questions for you. We'd love to hear about your experience. And really anybody who's, wants to talk about the history of automation. I've reached out to people who are involved with Cymax. We've reached out to other people. So just to keep the series going, we want to get this all, on a video format, so it'll be around forever. So if anybody's curious about these companies or products in the future, they'll be there. Maybe one day we'll have a museum as well. But I just want to encourage any of the listeners or viewers to contact me if you want to come on. These 2 gentlemen are great. They would love to pepper you with some very high quality questions. But in any case, did anybody else have anything to add as we're getting ready to close out the show?
The only thing that I can suggest, automationmuseum.org is where to go to learn more about stuff. We're donating our time and efforts to try to document what happened. And at the end of the day, if there's anybody out there that knows what happened, please contact Shawn so that we can document what happened.
Yeah, document history.
Important. Yeah. All the young people coming up today think that, okay, I can just do this on my phone and everything's fine. You've got to know where the heck you've come from, but you also need to understand the trials and tribulations that had gone through the innovation, the passion, the hurt, the pain, if you will. Try printing out a program on a thermal printer for, 7 or 8 hours. and you'll understand a little bit about where we have all come from. But so please, if you have any what happened stories, it would be appreciated.
And Gary, we'll give you the final word. First of all, thank you for presenting today, and let's give you the final word.
Yeah, I agree. I guess my final word is a question. Hey, what's next? What are we going to talk about? Well, we'll decide that. But the beginnings of this industry was and the transition from the 70s to the 80s and 90s fascinates me. And the Jeremy with your relationship with Dick Morley, that was would love to hear those stories. Jim Pinto, I know is probably not available now, but you know him as well as anybody, and that would be a way to continue. But I think you could see that my enthusiasm today is really from those guys, my experiences with Wonderware and Triconics, and to be part of those startups. And every day is a chance, and you could fail, and it's competing against the big boys. I tell that to my students today. Hey, if you ever get the opportunity to do that, something you really believe in, think about it, go for it.
You have to.
Thank both of you, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all.
And thank you to
a great day.
Thank you to the audience, and until next time, everybody. Peace.
Thank you.